How do you react to silence? Isn't that hard? Is it hard? How many of you just can't do silence at all? Are there anyone out there? I mean, I know people who are like music people, phone people, TV in the background, TV and radio in the background, so that like just in case you miss one, you can grab the other. I mean, like we just don't do silence in our culture very well. I mean, we are constantly bombarded with so many things. And so today is going to be just a little bit more of kind of like a breath, chill. Just be silent before the Lord today. We all react to silence differently, but then I think we all react to silence from God differently. Like that's hard. You've been praying for something, you've been thinking about something, you've been wondering something for months, years, decades, and you sit back and you just say, where are you in this, God? Where have you been? What are you doing? Why? And then to throw in times where you're wrong also, like you ever been wrong in a situation and know you're wrong, but then there's still silence. You ever get the cold shoulder approach to discipline, like where you're wrong and everyone else knows you're wrong, but no one's looking at you and you're just like, that's hard. It's just hard. There's also really difficult times where you just gone through times of waiting. It's just kind of like, I'm here, God. I'm waiting. I'm wondering. How long can you sit in silence and just be? Just allow the Lord to minister to you and to just sit. I know oftentimes for me personally, when I'm sitting in times of silence, that's my brain like kicks into even harder overdrive, right? It's like trying to make up for the silence. I know for me personally, sometimes I've even sat with like a notebook, because like as my brain starts to like go crazy, if I can write down some of those things, then it helps like kind of clear them out, and I can like go back to them later. But even just sitting in silence with the Lord, allowing Him to minister, allowing Him to be, allowing us to know our place before God. It's just not where we normally like to be. Silence. Waiting. It can get uncomfortable, right? Just waiting. Where we've been in Habakkuk chapter 20, verse 20, that we're going to be really focusing on today. Pastor Jim had talked that it's possible, scholars think that Habakkuk was waiting for some of these answers 20, 25, maybe 30 years, just waiting for God to respond. I mean, it starts with Habakkuk back in chapter 1, basically just saying like, God, like, what are you doing? How long, O Lord, are you going to do this? Like, how long are you going to just allow this to happen? Like, look at these people. They've fallen away from you. Like, what are you going to do? When are you going to judge sin? When are you going to figure this out, God? Like he doesn't know. 20 years? Can you just... It's been like 5 minutes and we're already uncomfortable. Habakkuk it stretches us just a little bit because of the nature and character of, this Old Testament prophet, a judgment, waiting, lament. So I want to spend time today just allowing the Lord to minister through silence, allowing the Lord to minister through these woes. And so if you go back, if you open up, we've been in Habakkuk, and if you haven't been with us, and maybe your pages are still stuck together in Habakkuk, if you go back to the very last book of the Old Testament, which is Malachi, or we'll call him Malachi, then you go back 5 books, and that's where you get Habakkuk. So our message today really starts in verse 4, even though we're going to be focusing on verses 15 to 20 to kind of wrap up today our series on arguing with God. But it starts in verse 4. I'm going to be kind of preaching from the NLT today, and so there's this idea in verse 4 where there's this kind of juxtaposition between the person who is, the message says it, bloated by self-importance and pride versus the person who's living by faith, right? That's verse 4, the famous verse 4 that Paul picks up on in Romans. It says, mine says, look at the proud, they trust in themselves and their lives are crooked, but the righteous will live by their faith. And so there's this great divide between those who are, how picturesque. They're bloated by self-importance, and those who live by faith or live in the faithfulness of God. And so today, really what we're looking at is these 5 woes. Now, Pastor Jim last week talked about 3 of the woes, and I'll just be honest, it doesn't give me the warm fuzzies. You know what I mean? It's not like one of those messages where it's like, oh, that's, let's, no. Like, these are woes. These are judgments. These are pronouncements of, from the Lord through the prophet Habakkuk to say, like, look, these people, these Babylonians, and in turn, the judgment that I'm going to use against Judah and Israel, it's not like happy. I mean, like, when you've done wrong and, mom or dad comes home and looks at you, and is like, you've done wrong and they know you've done wrong, it doesn't exactly give you the most exciting feeling inside, and yet that's kind of where we're at. And so what I want to do today is be willing to rest in the Lord and in what He is doing, but then also to really understand these woes. And so if you're following around or following along in your notes, the first 3 woes, like I said, Pastor Jim kind of already talked about, and they follow along right through. And so they start right after, I think verse 9 is the first one, and depending on what translation you have, but they'll start to put them out there. And so the first one is this idea that the plunderer or those who are going forward, plundering and ransacking and do it, they're actually going to be ransacked and plundered. And so, as you can see, most of these judgments are like, you're doing this? Well, guess what? That's what I'm going to do to you. And so the next one that Jim talked about is the extortioner, or the person who's manipulating. They're going to be found out, and they're going to be manipulated and destroyed. And then the last one from last week is that the violent are going to be put to justice. And so you have this, again, this great divide of those who are doing these things, and then this judgment is going to be pronounced upon them. And so verse 4 gives it to you. I just pull it up again. So it's kind of like looking at the proud. They trust in themselves. Their lives are crooked. And so what I want to do is to step back as a church and to say, okay, God, how do I understand? How do I look at my own life and my own sin? How do I accept the judgments and the oracles of God in me? How do I be sensitive to that? But then at the same time, how do I understand, okay, you know what? God is judging an evil people called the Babylonians. It's a letter that we have that we're reading now, 2,500, 3,000 years later. And during Habakkuk's time, you have he's basically saying God, what are you going to do? And if you remember in chapter 1, God basically says, I'm going to do something that you didn't even know or think about could ever happen. I'm going to judge you with these hated, evil Babylonians, and they're the ones that are going to come. And so it's again, there's so much of this that we sit back and we just think, wow, God, okay. Am I in this camp of the proud, the trusting in themselves, where my lives are crooked? Maybe I'll say it like this. If God was going to come here now, maybe to this church, to Northeast Ohio, right here this year, right now in this context, what judgments would he pronounce? What would he have to say? What would he have to say if he looked at your life and did an investigation? And I don't believe that it's something that, as followers of Jesus, that we have to fear. However, it is something that we need to revere. We understand the fear of God is not I'm cowering and I'm afraid. It's I'm in awe and in reverence of who God is, and I have a realization that I am not He. In the olden days, people would kind of dress like this, right? They'd have their suit. I'm not wearing a necktie, so maybe I'm not as done up as I should be. But in the old days, did anyone grow up going to church in suit and tie? Were there suit and tie people? Some people, not everybody. That was just kind of the way you did it. And some of it was getting yourself in your Sunday best and being ready to approach God. The approaching Him with awe and reverence, that. We've missed a little bit of that nowadays. Now, some of it I think is healthy, right? Some of it is okay, I don't have to doll myself up in order to go to church, right? God accepts me, He loves me, He knows me, He cares for me exactly where I am. And yes, He does. But this is also God we're talking about. I had somebody who said, the whole Jesus is my homeboy kind of mentality actually does more hurt for the church than necessarily it does good, because yes, he's your friend, right? Jesus is a friend of sinners, but He's also God. And where's the awe? Where's the reverence? Where's the falling down on our faces before God? You think of every time God or even an angel from heaven comes and meets a group of people. Do you remember what their reaction is? Their reaction is falling on their faces And their first words, if they're, treating them well, their first words are, do not be afraid. I bring you good tidings of great joy that will be for all the peoples. It's like every time they have to be reminded when they're in the presence of God, like, don't be afraid. Because I think there's going to be some knee knocking that happens. And maybe there should be. Maybe there should be. Where's our awe? Where's our silence? I was watching one of my favorite clips of The Wizard of Oz. When they go in to see the wizard, for the first time, and the Cowardly Lion's freaking out, and all of a sudden you hear this booming voice like, silence! There's some awe there. I mean, I'm thankful, that's not how we come to church, where we're freaking out, but there's something to be said for reverence. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these remaining two woes. We're going to try to understand them, and we're also going to try to figure out, how do we do with arguing with God and understanding who he is? Because our ethics, what we do, how we live our life, always has to be influenced by our theology and what we understand about God. And so today's another one of those days where we're gonna sit back and we're gonna allow God's word, the understanding of what is happening, to then influence how we live and how we work in our lives. And so, so let's do it. So we're gonna jump in to two more woes. So it's not exactly the warm fuzzy, but these are woes pronounced from God against the people of Babylon, and then we're gonna try to understand them and apply them into where we are. And so I'm not gonna have you stand because I'm gonna do this in chunks, and so I don't want to stand up, sit down. And so here we go. The first woe for today, verse 15. What sorrow awaits you who make your neighbors drunk? You force your cup on them so you can gloat over their shameful nakedness. But soon it will be your turn to be disgraced. Come, drink and be exposed. Drink from the cup of the Lord's judgment, and all your glory will be turned to shame. You cut down the forests of Lebanon, now you will be cut down. You destroyed the wild animals, so now their terror will be yours. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled the towns with violence. There's an aspect that there was this great people of Babylon who did all of these terrible things, who thought that they were getting, amazing power and authority from all these things. But actually, what God is saying is that the very things that you thought were bringing, power and authority, the disgraceful things, the disgraceful people are now going to be brought to shame. So let's look at this woe a little bit more. The first thing I want to see is right there from verse 16, where it says, but soon it will be your turn, or the idea from the Message in verse 16. I love this idea, is that, you thought you were having the time of your life. Well, guess what? Wrong. It's a time of disgrace. And so the idea here is that your sin is going to find you out. Did you know that? Did you know that you can't hide? Did you know that you can't run from your sin? That God knows all? Talk about wanting our ethics and our lifestyle, or our orthopraxy is the term to determine what we believe. What we believe to determine how we live. Well, know that your sin will find you out. The very things that these people, the Babylonians, were doing are the very things that they were now going to have happened to them, and we're now going to be absolutely disgraced before it. And so I ask you, it's kind of like, again, today's one of those days to kind of sit and to allow some silence. Are you aware of your own sin that's going to be found out? Are you aware of it? Do you hide it? Or do you live in a new reality of what God is doing in and through you? Are you allowing it to stay hidden and therefore to still be a shackle around your feet? Like, I think of just that idea of, I'll get to verse 15 here in a second, but in 16, I mean, he's basically saying, God is saying to the people, like, hey, come on, you can go down that road, but you're going to be exposed. Come and drink. It's actually going to bring shame down upon you. You're going to drink from the cup. Some translations say the cup of the Lord's right hand, which is really the cup of judgment. Like, you're going to be judged for what you are doing. The next idea really describes this whole idea of shame. And so, I wonder to you, we don't talk probably enough about shame. However, in our culture today, we actually have started to openly shame people depending on the things that they've done. That's the whole idea of cancel culture. If you're not familiar with cancel culture, you should read all about it. It's so interesting. But, it's like where someone has done something or has made a mistake. And so basically, everyone rallies around to destroy that person's life and basically says, like, they have no more voice. Right? You see it all the time. And so it's like, what... Again, in an idea of pausing, like, what really does bring honor in our culture today? I mean, I made just a short list in my own mind. I mean, obviously, I think we honor people who love family. We honor people who are hardworking. We honor people who are very tolerant and understanding. And as a culture as a whole, I think those are some simple things that we honor. We honor wealth and authority. But what brings shame in our culture? I think standing for truth brings shame, unfortunately. Telling someone that they're wrong can bring shame. In this day and age, what God is telling through Habakkuk is that the very things that they thought were bringing them power and influence from Babylon is actually bringing shame. So, I mean, they stood for things like violence and extortion and manipulation, and even in the passage it talks about this seduction. There's also harm to the environment right there in verse 17. Verse 15 is probably the hardest verse to understand in the passage because if you listen to the phrase, it says, how terrible it will be for those who make your neighbors drunk, who force your cup on them so that you can gloat over their nakedness and shame. And you're just kind of like, what? Like God, what is this? But the idea there, nakedness in the Bible has to do with shame and with, there's no covering. What was the very first thing that happened to Adam and Eve after they had sinned? But all of a sudden, they realized that they were naked and they hid, but they hid from God. And they put on, fig leaves and coverings because they all of a sudden realized they were naked. Look at later with Noah. Noah makes a mistake, right? He gets drunk and he's naked, and his family is just like shame, like shameful. like that they would do something. And so the scriptures describe this nakedness as bringing shame. And so basically what was going on was that the Babylonians were going about their destruction of the world, their polytheism, their drunkenness, their extortion, and they were like kind of like ruling the world through it. And God here is basically saying, like, the very things that you were doing are the things that I'm going to bring to you and bring you judgment. The things that you thought were bringing honor are actually going to bring shame. And really what he's talking about is that sin has brought shame into this world. And so shame, I think the best understanding of shame is this kind of inward guilt and hurt and pain that instead of like where guilt you can deal with and you can go to the cross, you can do it. Shame is this like collapsing in on itself pain. And I think that's one of the reasons why God is so quick to call this a woe and so quick to condemn it. Because, God doesn't want us to stay in shame. He doesn't want us to kind of continue. I keep looking inwardly, because like shame is this folding in of self upon self. And what God is calling to repentance and to change is this: no longer are you going to look in, but you're going to look up. Where's God? Verse 20, I read it once. We're going to look at it more. Verse 20 says, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him." And so I think it's good to pause and to look at the woe and to say, like, okay, where is my sin? Where is my life? Where am I going in that way? But not to bring shame, but to bring an understanding of who God is, not to look down and inward, but to look up to the God who loves and forgives and is there. Sin brought shame, but Jesus has brought forgiveness and restoration. That's the first woe, okay? The last woe starts right there in verse 18. We'll call it woe number 5, just because it's all of the woes. I'll read it right here. It says, "What good is an idol carved by man, or a cast image that deceives you? How foolish to trust in your own creation, a God that can't even talk. What sorrow awaits you who say to wooden idols, 'Wake up and save us.' To speechless stone images, you say, 'Rise up and teach us.' Can an idol tell you what to do? They may be overlaid with gold and silver, but they are lifeless inside." The last woe pronounced upon the people here is this idea that those who trust in idols will suffer grave loss. There is a God that we serve. There's a God that we can surrender and love and live with and commune with. And we every day, we substitute that for the living God. The whole idea with silence to me is so interesting because, instead of choosing silence and waiting and listening to the God who created us, we will fill all that space with created things all the time. And really, the passage starts, my version says, "What have you gained by worshiping?" And one translation just says, "What profit? What profit is an idol?" You ever just sit in silence and wait? What's it really gain you to worship created things? To yearn for comfort, to yearn for authority in yourself and not in God, to yearn for money. Friends. And so he goes through and gives us a number of understandings of what an idol is. And so I thought it was just so interesting, sort of like a little trying to grab some teaching from this. And the first one is that, it's just so, it's man-made, right? Why would you worship something that's man-made? And that's really what the woe about is that, I think 18 and 19 are basically this pause to say, why would you worship something that is man-made? What do you gain from that? Our desires are insatiable. It means that there'll always be more things to want after. And so why are you going to want after something that will only provide satisfaction for a short time that's made with human hands? What profit is that? The next one is, it's just an image. It's just a thing. End of verse 18 is so interesting. It just says, what fools you are to believe such lies. It says that the idol is actually a teacher of lies. It brings falsehood. Again, when we understand the truth of who we are and what we believe, and then we begin to understand, who God is, it organizes our thoughts in such a way that we can then worship the God who created us, and we don't think of ourselves too highly as we ought. That's a lot of life right there. Because the next one is, it brings self-reliance. The maker who fashions it is saying that they think it's going to save them. They think it's going to help them. It says, the woe, how terrible it will be for you who beg lifeless wooden idols to save you. What? It can't. It can't turn in on itself. It can't even speak. That's what God is basically saying. In the passage, it says, can an idol speak for God? It's not awake or active. And my favorite is probably this last one. In the end of verse 19, it says, they may be overlaid with gold and silver, but they are lifeless inside. It's a good, understandable translation, but if you have NIV or NASB or ESV, it says that there's no breath in it. That word breath is the word that we have for spirit, breath, wind, ruach. And so it's basically saying there's no spirit in it. There's no breath in it. You can dress it up all you want, but it don't have life. And so what God is declaring in these last two woes is you don't turn in on yourself, and then don't worship things that aren't God. Because he wraps it up there at verse 20, which is such a fitting end to not only the section on idols, but then the whole of the 5 woes. And he just says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent. So how are you going to argue with God? I'm not saying that you shouldn't. Because, I mean, I think if there's anything that we've learned from this series, at least what I've learned, is that, like, it's safe and okay, and not just like Habakkuk models this for us, but the psalmists model it for us. Like, be real with God, right? Like, we have enough fake things in this world. We don't also need fake Christians, right? So, like, be real with God. Like, God, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm hurting. Like, cry out to God and say those things. But I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying, how will you do it? Will you allow your understanding of who God is to determine the way that you lament and the way that you argue? Because again, verse 20, let's put it up there again. The Lord, where is he? He's in his holy temple. Let the earth be silent. So I think the wrapping up of verse 20 in these woes is to say, you can either be that person that's, bloated of self-importance and be like, we're the center of the world. We can argue with pride and self-reliance, or we can sit back and we say, you know what? I'm going to argue God with faith, and I'm going to trust. I'm going to wait. I'm going to pause. I'm going to look at him, and I'm going to say, God, I don't always understand all the things that are going on, but I trust you. And I know you. And so sometimes we're silent. Do you wait well? When Moses was up on Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, where were the Israelite people? They were down, waiting. Did they wait well? No. They basically recruit Aaron to make a golden calf for them to worship because they weren't waiting well. Sometimes we just got to wait. But we hate waiting. We just hate it. Where do you think God is in those times of waiting? Where is he? I mean, he's right here with us. We got to allow our understanding of who God is to infiltrate and impact all those different areas. But what I think just what's so interesting is that verse 20, tells us right where the Lord is, right? It says he's where? He's in his holy temple. Let the earth be silent. And so we do approach God with reverence and awe, don't we? We do, and it's right. And we should, because he's God. And yet we can also approach with great confidence. If you, I'll flip over. You don't need to necessarily flip over, but Hebrews chapter 4 tells us a little bit about this God whom we can approach. And it says this, starting there in verse 15. It says, this high priest of ours, talking about Jesus, understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same temptations we do, and yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it. Where is God? He's in his holy temple. And there's sometimes, we yak, don't we? I mean, we'll yak to each other, we'll yak to ourselves, we'll yak to Facebook, to random strangers, and we'll just and sometimes we just need to be silent before God and say, God, I know you're doing something. I just don't know what it is right now. And just wait, right? And listen and love and wait. God, would you help us wait well? God, would you help us understand what it means to live not in shame, but in confidence as we boldly approach your throne of grace? God, that we would live in confidence of who you are. God, that your holy and righteous direction, Lord, would guide each one of us. We know where you are, Lord Jesus. God, would we be silent before you? Because you're God and we're not. So what I want to do is just for a few minutes, just sit. Just sit in silence and listen to the Lord. You can be dismissed through the courtyard like usual in just a few moments. But I encourage you, if you're wanting to pray, if you're wanting to just listen, just sit. Don't rush. Meditate on this and let's just sit together.